Welcome. We should probably get started. So welcome to the third and last day of the fourth IESR-GLO Joint Conference on Social Safety Net and Welfare Programs. So today's schedule is similar to the first day with a keynote lecture and 4 presentations. We are very honored to have Professor Timothy Smeating, a leading expert on poverty, inequality, and social mobility, to give us the second keynote lecture today. Professor Smeating is Lee Rainwater Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs and Economics of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was also director of the Institute for Research on Poverty from 2008 to 2014, and was the founding director of the Luxembourg Income Study from 1983 to 2006. He was also named the John Kenneth Galbraith Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science in 2017. So Professor Smeating's recent work has been on social and economic mobility across generations, inequality of income, consumption, and wealth, and poverty in national and cross-national contexts. Those are obviously very important topics, especially nowadays. So his recent publications include SNAP Matters, How Food Stamps Affect Health and Well-being, Monitoring Social Mobility in 21st Century, From Parents to Children, the International Transmission of Advantage. I could go on and on, but today, Professor Smeating will talk about poverty and income support around the world, China, India, and Asia in comparative perspective. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Smeating to give the keynote lecture.
Thank you for the kind invitation and the lovely introduction, Suzanne. I am happy to be here with you. I see a few old friends and know there are others who are listening. So this was something that when you asked, I thought, well, you know what, it's been a while since I thought on these global terms, but I realized that, as you'll see, the Luxembourg Income Study now has over 60 countries, about 80% of the world population, including all the BRICS, you know, Britain, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And I thought, well, I'll put something together. So that's what I did. And this is only a place to build from, but I think it's an interesting place to build from. So here we go. So the abstract I sent, I'm going to look at economic growth and public tax transfer policy. And measurement is important. And of course, we have not measured the effects of COVID-19 recession on any of this yet, because we're still hoping people are alive, much less knowing more about their economic situation. We're going to use some World Bank data and mostly the LIST microdatabase. We're going to look at vulnerable groups, and we're going to ask questions. We're going to open more questions than we can answer. And I'll mention at the end the frontiers of sustainable human development and other things that are broader measures that may be also of interest. So there's going to be 6 parts: the introduction, the basics, you have to know the basics. World progress so far driven by growth, at least in terms of extreme poverty. Then a really nice contrast to think about in countries like China, where you don't think of relative mobility, but absolute mobility. And then a little bit of what social programs and poverty using lists, using one particular unified view. And then what's next in conclusion. So I can do all that in 45 minutes, and then I'll be able to answer some questions. So here we go. Now, this is very famous. Lord Kelvin was a physicist in England, and he invented something called the refrigerator, which they called the Kelvinator for a long time. And he once said, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. When you cannot measure it and express it in numbers, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory. So if you have numbers and they're comparable, you'll have whats. Then you have to figure out the whys, okay? So you'll see there's differences here and there. Well, why are they different? And that's the challenge. Now, this is a nice way to think about poverty measurement. This is from a handbook of poverty, and I wrote the chapter on, how do we think about it? And you can find all these measures of poverty out there in the literature. But mainly what we do is you take objective, meaning there's some number. We don't just ask people, do you feel you're poor? We're doing quantitative work, sometimes matched with qualitative work. That's called mixed methods. We're using a single dimension, although England now has deprivation indices. When England publishes a poverty report using numbers like I'm talking about income, they also have a deprivation index. So they look at multiple deprivation. Do people have enough to eat? Do they feel safe, and so forth? Then there's the index of well-being, and like all before me, pretty much I'm going to use income, although Andrea Bandolini and I have written on asset poverty, and a lot of people in the United States write about consumption poverty. And then you have to decide how are you going to measure it: relative, absolute, or anchored. So I'm going to run through all of that so that you understand. We're mainly going to look at relative and absolute. Okay. So you have to ask yourself the questions every time. Who do you want to talk about? It makes a big difference. You're looking at the working age population, the whole population, families with children. What are we measuring? Again, income, consumption, wealth, or net worth, shares or levels, and then against what measure of needs. Where? Which nations do you include? Exclude? Does it make a difference? When? How long is the trend? Is there a trend? I'm just going to look at, I'm not going to look at trends really today, other than in growth and absolute mobility. But when Luxembourg income study, you can have short trends for most of these countries because they keep building up their micro database. Why are you interested? Well, I'm just taking a broad talk today, but you may be interested in just children or just elderly or the working population or so forth. And then how do you measure it is all of the things above. So that's how those are the building blocks. Another very convenient thing to do that Lee Rainwater and I actually invented is to think about packages of income from 3 sources. Think about how much income you get from your own sources. That's going to be market income. That's what we're going to call market income. Labor market, capital market, savings, occupational pensions. And so essentially that's what you provide just for yourself, by yourself. And pre-distribution rules can apply, like minimum wage or hours and whatever, but that's what you earn yourself within that context. Then family members, which turn out to be increasingly important now. So private transfers from those living in other households, including those abroad, remittances. There's a couple of nice, Martin Evans has a nice paper in lists on remittances, which make huge difference in the Philippines and Nepal, in some countries, because older children go abroad, make money, send it back. And then there's also strategic inter vivos transfers, where wealthier parents or grandparents do things at particular times for their children or grandchildren. And those are increasingly important. And we're just starting to dig into those in the United States. So paying your school tuition, helping you live in an expensive city till you get a good job and things like that. And then when you look at elder poverty, you have to know the living arrangements to take a deep look, because if the elderly are living alone, there's a much higher probability of being poor than if they're living in a multi-generational household, even if both generations would like to live next door to one another and not with one another. Okay. So there's own efforts, extended family members effects, and then the state of the public sector, which means that somebody pays taxes and somebody gets benefits. And so that's disposable income. We're going to look at the 2 in red today. They're the building blocks for poverty measurement. Now, we're going to look at persons. You count persons in households. They're the sharing unit. So a 10-person household has 10 people. That counts 10 times more than a 1-person household, which is 1 person. Okay. Then there's a really important question of adjusting for family size or economies of scale. Really important. Lee Rainwater and I decided that we take the square root of family size, which says if 1 needs 100, 4 need 200. And you can use any parameter you want. The World Bank does nothing but per capita. So epsilon equals 1. There's no economies of scale. Okay. So per capita, a 10-person household is total income divided by 10. That's it. And if epsilon is 0, household size is irrelevant, then it doesn't matter how big a household you have, you just pick some level. None, the latter two, per capita is used often, the other one is not at all. And then if you want to measure absolute poverty or well-being, you have to use purchasing power parities. And purchasing power parities are like wine. You have to know the vintage and how good the year was. In general, you use the most recent ones, which the International Pricing Project now has very good estimates for places like China and India, a quarter of the world's or more of the world's population. And if you use those, you're able to look at real incomes across countries. So those are some of the building blocks. Then you need a poverty line. You have resources, you need to compare it to something. And the easiest across nations is 40, 50, 60% of the median. So if you know the median income, you adjust it for family, you adjust everything for family size, you know what the median income is. Those living below half of it are poorer. That's what OECD, enlists, and others use. The Brits, 60% of median income. That's the poverty line in Europe, actually, all of the official European poverty line. And 40% is closer to where the US is. I just did 50 today, but you can do all these in lists. Now, absolute poverty is it's a funny thing. So in the United States, we set an official poverty line in the 1960s, and it hasn't changed. So it used to be about 45, 48% of median income. Now it's about 25%. So you don't need any growth. You need no change in distribution, and just growth reduces poverty. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We have another supplemental line, which is a better measure, and so forth. And then there's anchored poverty. I think you'll learn something from relative poverty and anchored. So what you do is you take relative poverty, let's say in 2011, half the median, and you take that line and you just increase it by a price index. That tells you how people have done over the last 10 years in terms of a fixed line, okay? And what happens is if the economy's been bad, if you've had a great recession like they had, in the United States and Europe in the mid 2000s, it turns out poverty will rise because people aren't doing as well. And then you compare that to the relative, how people are doing relative to the median. They tell you different things, and they're both can be important. Deep poverty is half the overall poverty line. People are really hurting, but the further down you go, the more you worry about people not reporting their incomes correctly in the surveys, which is a valid concern. And then some people look at extreme poverty. The World Bank, of course, dollar became $1.90 a day, $2 a day, to $6 a day. And that's purchasing power parity adjusted. It depends on the question, of course. And we're not going to focus on any one question today. We might have made different choices then. Now, so that gives you a what. You're going to see a whole array of poverty rates. That's what's. Then the questions are, why? Why are people poor? And that's the really important question, and that's the hard one. Economic change, the anchor line, as I said, is useful. In the distribution of income growth or decline, is it inclusive or pro-poor, or does most of the dividends of growth go to the top of the distribution? Demographic change, I wrote on child poverty in Sweden, where the right said it's all about immigrant kids. Not true. They just let their social assistance line decay over time. That's what happened. It isn't immigrants, despite the fact that in Sweden, 75% of the immigrants are refugees, very poor people who they take in. As my colleague and co-author Marcus Yanti used to like to say, there are more Iraqis in Sweden than in the United States. That was true, more refugees. And if I was an Iraqi refugee, I'd probably want to go to Sweden too. Then you have unmarried and complex family poverty. Living arrangements are important, single parents, doubling up for elders and older youth. So to the extent that the elders live with their children, the marginal cost using any equivalent scale is small, and they're likely to not be poor. But could they afford to have their own place to go over the poverty line for one? No. So it kind of hides it. And then youth, depends where you are. In Italy, where Enrica lives, youth stay at home until they're in their 30s. So they don't form smaller single households the way they do in Northern Europe, for instance. So demographic change and differences can be an issue. Private transfer is obviously an issue. Policy effects, what do you count? We count cash and near cash. So things that are close to cash. So food benefits and housing benefits. We do not count health or education benefits in determining poverty unless you're crazy. There are a few crazies in our country, but no one does this. And sometimes you want to look at long-term investments and how they work out. So if you spend your money on education and health and not income support, you're planning more for the future. You're building, you're building a stronger society with healthy kids who are well educated, and that will serve you in the long run. Countries like Korea have done that very well, and to some extent also China. So I want to look at world progress so far, and it's pretty much all been driven by economic growth. So the first Millennium Development Goal target was to cut the 1990 extreme poverty rate, that's $2 a person a day, in half by 2015, by 2020, excuse me, by 2015, but they reached it in 2010, okay? And according to the most recent estimates in 2017, under 10% of people, only 900 million people in the developing world live at or below $1.90 a day, down from 37% in 1990 and 44% in 1981. So this is growth. So this is why the Luxembourg Income Study, when I left the directorship, I had a grant from the National Academy of Sciences. I worked with people at the World Bank like Martin Ravalian and Peter Langeau, who's now running lists, and others, to bring more middle-income countries in. And as you can see, the number of countries with per capita income of $1,000 or less fell drastically. Okay, the number with who are lower middle, 1,000 to 4,000, rose till the early 2000s, then fell as well. And what's risen are the high income countries and the upper middle income countries. And the more a country gets to be an upper middle income country, the more they look like other Western places. It's a wage economy, no longer dependent on self-sufficient agriculture and so forth. And then comparison gets easier because you could be on the same terms. You have to deal with unpaid labor and things like that, but Liz has done a good job with that. So this is the growth. And this is a picture. Now there's just, if you don't know him, you must, Our World in Data by Max Roser. Max works with Brian Nolan in Oxford, and Max is a magician with pictures, diagrams. His illustrations are incredibly good and incredibly useful, great teaching things, great learning things. So go to Our World in Data and look at Max's work. And they're not just on poverty, not just in inequality. So you can see the whole distribution moving to the right. You can see Asia and Pacific, that's in red, moving up. And what's left below that line, that's progress. That's how we moved. So here's an example of China. China's war on extreme poverty worked. So in other words, the fraction of Chinese living below $2 per capita has gone down below 10%. And I know that the prime minister or the leader of the country has decided that he wants to have zero poverty sometime soon, which is zero is a really hard number to get to in terms of anything, zero pollution, zero anything, but they can get pretty close. And if we solve Africa, if we solve sub-Saharan Africa and its problems, that's the blue bar, we'd be under 250 million by 2030. That's the SDG 2030 goal is 250 million extremely poor people in the country. Now, environmental change makes it harder. The pandemic has made it harder in a lot of countries and so forth, but that's still their goal. And you can see that most of the work needs to be done in Africa. That's where the extreme poverty in the world is today. So this is all good news. And you can hear, you can look, you can see sub-Saharan Africa, you can see India doing an okay job, China doing a very good job, East Asia, Pacific doing well, Middle East and so forth. So it's countries are going in the right place, and that's only based on economic growth, okay? Not so much income support programs. And you can do this dynamically on this website and play around with it and have a good time. But now what's next? And this is a question that my colleague, co-author, and close friend, Tony Atkinson, asked in his last book, Measuring Poverty Around the World, which was written, he wrote his part of the book, which is most of the book, 2/3 of it, in the last 2 months before he died on January 1st, 2017. And then two of his students, John Micklewright and Andrea Brandolini, finished the book for him. And he said, okay, it's time to stop setting the goal at $2 a day. It can't be as high as $30 a day, which is Denmark 60% median EU lines. What it works out to is $30 a day. But there's a lot of space between those, and we can measure progress against something that's a little bit higher. And we can talk about inclusive growth and things like that. And so he started using national definitions and put things together to compare and apply them. So the World Bank now today, Martin Rebellion left, of course, and retired, shows you not how many are below $2 a day, but $3.20 a day and $5.50 a day. Okay, they're directly available. You can go and pull them down. You can't get the microdata, which is difficult, but you can just, there's a big spreadsheet that you can take them from. So, I mean, so the World Bank has these numbers, but you rely on secondhand data. You don't access the microdata, so you can't feel the data like with Liz. They use the per capita equivalent scale, and it's hard to get at some policy effects because in some countries, like in China, the Chinese income project, the CHIP data, Chinese income project data, is only disposable income. So what you can do is try and take social assistance or government assistance out of that and see how many are left. But that's not like saying before and after. And so here's a diagram that you could spend a week on. We're not going to spend a week on it. This will be available to everybody. These are the fraction of this is the global income distribution up to $30 per person per day. Okay, and you can see that living in less than $190 a day is really low, other than in Africa. Living more than $190 and less than $10 a day is a big chunk now in the world. Not so much in high income countries, but in some Asian countries. So that's sort of the middle class now. Living on $10 to $30 a day is small, and then living on more than $30 a day, that's mainly the rich and prosperous countries. So you can, these numbers are there. They give you what's again, but not why's. Another way to look at it is this picture. You see the $30 a day line. 82% of the world's population live in countries where the mean income is less than $20 a day. Okay, so it's still, to get to the $30 is a long, long way to go. And you can see that the mean daily income, according to the World Bank, in India is $450 a day, and the mean in China is $1240 a day. Of course, that's the mean. Why not the median? I don't know. It's the mean, and it's pulled up by a lot of high-income countries. Okay, so that's progress against absolute poverty, and it just takes income per capita. It can be useful. It's a good start. Okay. Then now I want to talk about something a little different, but it's, I think, very interesting, particularly in the Asian context and in the Chinese context. Increasingly, less of the growth dividend goes to the poor and middle income units in the Western China. Inequality is rising there too. Now, trends seem universal. Patterns can be muted by policy. So I'm just going to look at 3 countries, France, the United States, and China, and I'm going to look at their absolute income growth versus inequality growth, okay? And that leads you sort of to shared prosperity. We're not there yet, but real income growth is important and it can't be ignored. Relative poverty says nothing about real income growth. And you have to pay attention, particularly if you want to talk about how happy people are, how hopeful people are, and move to, well-being measures like that. So here we go real quickly. 3 countries, the top 10% share of income. United States, very high. China rising rapidly, at least until the mid-2000s. France, fairly flat. That's the fraction of income that goes to the top 10%. Okay? It's rising. The share of income that goes to the bottom 50% is falling everywhere but France. So you're getting a much lower share. The bottom half is getting a much lower share In China, a much lower share in the United States. Again, those reflect inequality, okay? And then finally, look at wealth inequality, look at asset inequality. And since about 1980, that's been fairly flat in Britain, who's also in this chart, in France, but of course it's been rising rapidly in China and in the United States. So that looks like highly unequal countries. You know, there's a lot of strife there. This isn't working well. But wait a minute. We're going to study this one for a while. We're going to look at real growth in income, not just inequality. So on the left is China, which from 1978 to 2015 grew at 6.2% a year. The bottom half, that's the red one, grew at 4.5%, and then the top grew more, means more inequality. The US grew at much lower rates and very little growth in the bottom 50, almost zero. France grew at a much slower rate, but more evenly, okay? And now, of course, China is the most rapidly recovering country, and their real growth is up again. But here's the punchline. This is what I'm trying to get at. Economic growth can make a difference to well-being, allows greater social investment in health, education, and more. I can show that in a minute. And we turn to relative poverty measurement and effects of policy. You only look at relative amounts. You're not looking at real growth. But think of China. Shenzhen, I don't know, your grandparents or great-grandparents grew up under Mao. Their kids were better off. Their kids are, you are better off, and your children will be better off. If you're growing at 4 and 5% real income at the bottom, you're making real progress, and that is important, and it cannot be denied. You have to understand rising standards of living are important, even if the yachts are going up much faster than the tugboats and the rowboats, but it is really important, okay? Think of the rule of 70, divide 5% into 70. That's a doubling of the standard of living in 12, 13, 14 years. And if you continue to do that, or you've done that, that is amazingly, and it's really important. So I don't want you to lose that. Whenever you're talking about relative numbers, don't lose the fact that growth, especially even if it's not widely shared, okay, growth is terribly important to people, knowing that their kids will be better off than they are. That's not true in the United States. Only about less than half the children will be better off than their parents, according to Raj Chetty. But don't lose that. So this is a separate little thing I wanted to put in here. Absolute income growth is really, really important, and you can tolerate a lot of inequality when your own situation is getting better and you can see it generation to generation. And of course, then higher incomes say, what can you buy, right? You can reduce poverty. You can buy better education, better health, increase life expectancy, and improve government finances. And those are the challenges that the Asian countries in particular face today, as well as the Western countries, okay? Who gets the benefits? Are we doing a good job reducing poverty? What are we doing in terms of life expectancy and so forth? So I wanted to put that in there. Now we'll take a look at social programs. The LIST project harmonized accessible household survey-based microdata from the 70s to 2019. Income, wealth, and consumption. I'll show you a slide in a minute. It's now grown to cover 600 data sets from 60 countries, 85% of the world's population. And the microdata is there. You can use the microdata yourself, or you can go and pull down, matrices and run numbers and so forth. And I just had the LIST staff who knows the data really well. They all used to work for me. They just ran me some numbers on half median poverty, which is what I'm going to talk about now, just as a first cut, which is what this is. So here's the world that LIST has, okay? Income and consumption and wealth data, income and wealth, income and consumption, income only, consumption only. It tells you the number of countries and so forth. You can find that on their website now. But you can see that in Africa, the coverage is much less. They got South Africa and Egypt, which I'll talk a little bit about today, increasingly more in South America, and increasingly more in Asia, okay? And this is really important, that you've got a huge chunk of the world population, and they're growing to the point where they look a lot like other countries. So what we're going to look at is a league table at 50% of the median with many nations, a couple of them. Then the effects of the income support systems at half the median income. Overall children and elderly. The most important thing this has is the BRICS. So the big growing countries, Britain, Russia, India, China, South Africa are all there. 4 or 5 waves of data for some of them, 2 or 3 for others. They have Asia. We're going to look at Laos, South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And then we're going to look at Australia, Canada, Egypt, just for the heck of the fact that they've got some decent data now for a Northern European country, Mexico, and the United States. And so I just selected those countries for a first view. And here's what things look like. Here's a bar chart. Relative poverty rates. It can be a little hard to see. We'll look more detail at a few of them in a minute, but you can see that the United States is highest. Oh, no, United States is, I'm off one. They're second highest to Israel. Israel has high relative poverty. Why? Because the Israelis live well and the Muslims don't. That's why. So you need to know that. If you look at relative poverty in Israel, you have to understand the segregated Muslim populations and the impoverished populations. But if you use a relative poverty measure, Mexico is just a little above the United States, India a little bit higher, China fairly high, South Africa really high, and Peru the highest. So this is just an example of some what's. This is just a big league table. So now we're going to look at the ones I concentrated on. So if you look at disposable income poverty, income less than half the median, you see Brazil, China, India, Russia, South Africa, there are the BRICS. Laos, the same countries I mentioned, and overall children and the elderly. In many countries, children are poorer than overall, although there's been some real progress in places like Australia and China in particular. Elder poverty is really strange in South Korea. Their Minister of Finance actually came to see me. They have high income poverty in South Korea, but if you counted the wealth that older people have, they'd be much better off. So you're sort of in a conundrum. You may be looking at the wrong index, but otherwise their numbers pop out on any chart. We'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. But you can see in general, the West, in some cases, the West and the East aren't that different. I'm not sure the Russian longitudinal study, I hope it's accurate, but most people believe in the Chinese, Brazilian, South African data anyway, collected by good academics who we know. And you can see that, children are more likely to be poor, and that's too bad because I think you judge countries in the way they treat their children. And I'm not going to spend time with this now. You've got you can look at. Now, so China enlists, China does not have a market income poverty. The Chinese income data chip is only disposable income, but the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has managed to say, take disposable income and take away social assistance and call that market income. And they get about a 5% reduction, which is modest. You have to remember, though, we're probably looking at a really high poverty line here, way above where Davao and other things are. And if you had a poverty line of 40% of the median or 30% of the median, that might be a better choice if let's say you're just comparing among the BRICS or among the Asians. Laotian data is the same way. South Korea have reduced poverty pretty well for a 10% reduction. Taiwan better. Vietnam small. And then Australia and Canada, of course, they make big efforts. They have good programs for elderly and children in particular. Egypt has a small one, but it's starting. Mexico, okay. And the United States, not so well at this level because this is way above where we measure poverty. So the international standards, we've always looked bad because our poverty lines are 40 or 30%, not 50% of the median. And you can see kids then, and then you can see the elderly. I'm not going to dwell on the numbers. I'm just going to give you some sort of 3 quick summaries. So the overall poverty is highest in Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and Laos. They're highly unequal. Fraction less than half the median is fairly high. Child poverty exceeds overall poverty in many nations. Some exceptions, South Korea, mainly through the labor market and strong employment for everybody, pretty much. Taiwan, Australia, Canada, and soon the US. And the answer is a child allowance. Canada instituted a child allowance in 2015 and cut their child poverty rate by 40%. The United States, starting next month, is giving children from 0 to age 6, $300 a month, and children from ages 6 to 17, $250 a month. It's going to be deposited every month in their parents' accounts, and it's going to make a whole bunch of difference according to the National Academy of Sciences report, which Robert Moffat, who was on earlier this week, and I both worked on with Greg Duncan, Hillary Hoynes, and a number of other people. We had a big impact. They actually did what we said they should do, and now we're going to have a big dent in child poverty in the U.S. Elder poverty is high, but can be misleading. So income poverty and wealth poverty in South Korea are fairly different. Doubling up means lower poverty rates. And Western numbers reflect social pensions that have lower payouts than half the median. That's part of the problem. So in the market income, we include occupational pensions. Now, why do I say occupational pensions? Because occupational pensions are in Asia are quite often the pensions that public servants get. They list it as social insurance, but it's really an occupational pension, and it doesn't do much to reduce poverty. And it turns out it's their pension based on their employment, and others don't have it. So that could be part of the reason. Summary: social assistance today affects in Asia. Redistribution is smaller. Some of it's not very redistributive, as I just said. Social pensions for civil servants only. It's essentially an occupational pension, even though it's paid through the public sector. Another part of the problem, looking at these income numbers, is investments in health and education aren't apparent here. And those are important in the long term. They make a big difference, okay? So income support, net of direct taxes at a common poverty line is what you get. And if you look closely before at the child poverty rates, you see in South Korea that there's more children living below half the median, even though it's below 7%, after taxes and transfers than before, which means their parents are paying more in taxes than they're getting in benefits. That's because their targeting programs are much below. Now you have programs like the BAO in China, in theory, targeted lower income levels are ineffective in reaching large numbers of people and often not well targeted. But I must say some of the sponsors of this, the ADB, and some of the sponsors of this seminar series, this workshop you're at, are doing interesting work in that, and they're going to know more about it soon. Okay, that's all I can say now. But their DBAO is being evaluated. But the idea that you could move, as South Africa has, to some very modest, small child allowance, so that every kid had some amount, even $1 a person a day to every kid, let's say, would be $365 in, for every day of the year. That would make a big difference. It make any difference in the United States, but it would make a huge amount of difference in a place like South Africa. So looking into these programs is next. And finally, here's the deal. Here's where we are right now. Absolute poverty has fallen. It's driven by economic growth. Not just extreme poverty, living standards are rising in the face of rising inequality in most mixed nations and in many rich nations. Okay, not always, but in many. Relative poverty is the highest in the developing world and most BRICS using common standards. So Mark Revalian, who sent me a paper a year or so ago, I sent him a couple of comments, and it's now published in the Annual Review of Economics, and you can download it. He agrees. He looks at the World Bank analysis alone and says that fewer people are poor by global absolute standards, more are poor by country-specific relative standards. That's true. And like I do, he also thinks it's worth looking at both. Where are you in terms of absolute well-being? Where are you relative to the median person in your country? So those are essentially two of the building blocks, and you can do these things, okay? Now, what's next? Better measures of holistic well-being, mobility, security, human development. So maybe we look at short-term income and short-term effects on policy, and maybe too narrow. The same if you just look at economic growth. Maybe we should be more interested in mobility across generations, relative mobility, the people stay stuck in their social position, which I'll show you in just a minute, okay? Or absolute mobility, meaning that children are better off than their parents in terms of absolute levels. We should be doing both, and we can do both, okay? There's some evidence that public investment in China improves mobility, but mainly for the middle classes. If you click on that blue bar, you'll find an article that was recently published on that, I think by Chin Gao, who I know very well, who's at Columbia University, and who's probably the leading, with Yu Chia, the two leading social scientists in the United States, who, in my opinion, who study China. Okay. But it's still not a very mobile society. Or you look at happiness, where I think China is generally a happy society because, again, successive generations are better off. And if you ask older people about life satisfaction, they tend to be happier when they know that their kids are better off than they were and their grandkids are better off. So here's something that Miles Korak threw together. Okay. This is the correlation between father's income and son's income. Not enough women working, he could find fathers and sons. And the higher that correlation, the less the mobility, right? So if you look more like your father, there's very little mobility. So if there's, like in Peru, if there's a 70% chance that your child's going to end up in the same social position as you were, the same rank from 0 to 100, let's say, that's not a very mobile society. You see South Africa, China, Brazil, still being fairly immobile for that reason, okay? The United Kingdom and the United States also fairly immobile. And you have to go down to places like Denmark, Finland, Scandinavia, even Canada and Australia, where you can, those are the blue lines, Canada, Australia, where you can get a fairly high mobility. So that's really important. What is it these countries do? I did this book that Shazang mentioned when he introduced me with Marcus Yanti and John Ermish called, From Parents to Children, Comparative International Intergenerational Mobility. And you can see countries that invest early in kids, invest in their education and so forth, do a better job than others who don't. But you can click on Korak there and you can find it. So here's where you end up. You end up in this world of John Helliwell, who's a Canadian who made happiness or well-being the most famous. Does growth bring happiness? It improves resources for education, more spending in healthcare, enables more consumption. That's a positive. But if you get a lot of crime with it, if you get a lot of the diseases of affluence, is what he calls them, a lot of environmental costs, a lot of pollution, which is going to be maybe the death of all of us, and understanding diminishing marginal utility of income, the answer could be no. So it's balance. His idea, you should balance those things. And you can go to places like the Social Progress Index. You can click on that number where they have a whole bunch of indicators in terms of the safety, the well-being, the healthiness of the population. And the OECD's Living Well project does the same thing. They have measurable attributes of happiness or well-being. And they may be worth looking at, not just income poverty, okay? If my generation looked at that, I'm 73. So your generation can look at something, younger people, something different. And the question is, how do we enhance human achievement, development, and capabilities in a more sustainable world that's threatened by environmental disruption and hardships it'll cause us to the poor? The effects of climate change are highly unequal. My students and I did a paper for the OECD on this, showing how much children suffered from fires and floods and so forth and so on. And it's always the poorest, and their lives are disrupted and so forth. But I want to leave those questions to the next generation myself. So I want to conclude that bad outcomes are not inevitable. We can do better. We can invest in human capital, health, education, upward mobility. That's really important. In China, broader investments, more regional universities. You don't have to just be in Beijing or Shanghai to do well. Do it more in good universities in the provinces. World inequality grows. The capital share is growing all over the world relative to the labor share. You have to tax capital the same as labor, in my opinion. We have to share profits more widely. How owners treat valued workers will be important if they're scarce and highly productive. And in a world with very low population growth now, including the United States, people are paying more attention to that. I would endorse in the whole world, including Asia, mandatory defined contribution pensions, meaning that in Australia, every dollar you earn, 13 cents of it gets put into a superannuation scheme that's managed by a third party. And those are honest third parties. And it's for savings. And it means that each successive generation of elders in Australia will have a decent standard of living later in life. You should have that in most of Asia. Employer labor partnerships are incredibly important, not just post-secondary education and training, but German work sharing. Fantastic idea spreading around the world. Danish and European active labor market programs. So if you have a minimum wage that's 14 or 15 euros an hour, no employer is going to hire them unless they can do something. So they need some training. Okay? Promoting shared prosperity and inclusive growth is important. We should value firms for more than their bottom line. What's the quality of their work environment? What's the dignity of work? Do they have, and things like that. And giving labor a voice in political discourse and in more business boards is really important. Labor in countries which have labor parties, you do much better. In countries like the United States, where there is no voice for labor, you do much worse. And you could go on. You could look at the Indian Employment Guarantee Program, where you guarantee people a job so much. You could look at whole bunches of ideas sprouting up from countries. Sometimes you borrow them, like the United States finally borrowing the child allowance one. Sometimes you do your own. So that's what I have to say, and we'll take questions in a minute. There's a lot about lists here. There's a lot about other data sources that I mentioned that you can go on these data sets and look at them. A lot of countries in there. There's some things that I've written recently, and other papers. There's one particularly looking at child poverty in the world, across the world. I have an addenda on growth and inequality, which is important, I think, why you should care. You can read that, get the numbers. And then there's the work, which I don't know well enough, of the ADB on social spending growth, particularly in Asia, social assistance contributions, and so forth. So that's what I have to say. And I'm very happy to take your questions. If I can get out of, I'll leave this, I'll get out of share. Is that okay, Shazan? Shazan, can I get out of share?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing. There we are. Now I can see you. Okay. And there aren't any questions in chat yet, are there? No. But if you have a question, please ask. Hello, Bjorn. Long time no see. Robert. Hello, Robert. So I'm happy to answer questions or think alongside you about things that I think are important.
So,
I could jump in with the question.
Sure.
Yeah, Robert, maybe you just go ahead, yes?
Okay, it's kind of a narrow question. I mean, interesting talk, Tim. Lots of interesting facts there and details. So that was really interesting. As well as a very narrow, kind of a narrow question relative to the broad scope of what you're talking about, but it came up when I was studying, looking more into the China DBAO program,
Yes.
which is that particularly the rural program. You've got a lot of countries at certain stages of development.
You're breaking.
Very large.
Robert, I can't hear you.
I think we have acoustics problems at the moment, and Shaisang somehow is lost. So you may maybe have to relax a few seconds just to see how it develops.
Sure. Robert, I'll answer your question as soon as I get it.
Yes, maybe, Robert, you can try to repeat the call. Robert? Oh, you cannot hear me either. Tim, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, yeah. Now Shaisang is back.
Suzanne, would like to get
Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Now
Hello?
we can hear you. Yes, now we
Oh,
can hear
great.
you.
Okay, great. Okay.
There was a problem in between, and well, Robert jumped in and asked a question, but it was too noisy that Tim could hear it. So maybe if Robert could repeat that question, maybe we can go on. And I withdraw now. Yes, okay.
Let me try again. I apologize. Tim, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was asking about rural areas. I was saying in Progressa, Mexico and Progressa, to establish eligibility for Progressa, they went in and see if you have a TV. The DeBao program in China, a lot of these local government areas, they're using assets basically and other kind of indicators. So has that been studied? Does that have an impact? Can you really measure it correctly? And how do you target in rural areas?
That's really important, Robert. I mean, obviously, if incomes are much higher in cities and lower in rural areas, you're more likely to be poorer by an income standard that averages in cities. But so in South Africa, they measure poverty by the quality of your housing in rural areas. How many square feet you have, whether you have bathrooms or indoor plumbing and so forth. And also the possession of durables. And that's probably a pretty good measure. There are people, Ingrid Wallenberg and others in South Africa who use these. The biggest thing that Liz had to do to make this work was to put a value on production for own consumption. So in other words, on rural farming. And it did. There's a value in there for that. It's low, but it's reasonable. And the bank helped us a lot with that. We walked into the World Bank in 2011 and they told us the following: we don't really compare across countries. We go to a country, we see what their problems are, we try to help them invest to fix them, and then we go to the next country. We really don't do comparisons. And then their world changed. And Tony Atkinson, Francois Bourguignon was the vice president then, talked them into the idea that comparisons were important. And now they have, this whole project that Peter Langeau was involved with at the beginning, and a number of other people now, where they are actually looking at inclusive growth and things across countries and comparing the way countries are growing. So that's all new, but list works in cities. Let's put it that way, Robert. But you could just pull.
Do you think this problem is serious enough that when the World Bank collects income, I don't know how they do, income in rural, how they measure it in rural areas. And so you're looking at the progress of poverty with development. You're shifting from rural to urban, and there's a different measurement there, of what income is.
That is still a huge problem. That was a bigger problem in 2011 than it is today, because a lot of people have made that shift. But you're definitely right, Robert. In the rural areas, particularly in South Africa and India and so forth, these are areas that you have to be careful about. You have to look at. You can't just pull out cities if you want. In a huge country like China or India, you probably want half the median in regions or in urban rural, not just half the median of the whole country. But that isn't a big issue. But Asia is very rapidly, as they grow, they're becoming much less indigenous farmers and peasants and much more wage labor workers. And that's part of that growth. And you need to study it. There are people who do study that. I'm not one of them, obviously, but there are people who do. It's a great question. Great question.
Any references? I'd be very interested in sending them. So you said there are people who study that. So
yeah, there are people. I'll ask the list people and a couple others. I remember some work on it at the bank a while ago before Martin and they do something there too. Anyway.
Okay. Any other questions? So can I ask one question, team?
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned that you briefly mentioned that the take-up rate is low for debug in China, and I remember Robert also said a little bit about that. So so one observation we had when we were doing field service in rural areas of China is that so suppose this old couple they have some married adult son or daughter who is not living with them, and they have with no transfers, so they are not giving money to support the old couples. But the local people, the villager leaders will still think that you have someone to depend on, even even though they're not doing that. So what is your opinion of how do you think of this practice? Does this make sense? Because I wasn't not sure, because
It's different. The DBOW program and others there, not everyone qualifies, and there's a lot of local judgment, as you were mentioning, about
yeah.
who's poor, who isn't, who has support and who doesn't. And that gets to be very judgmental. And as Robert knows, in the work we did in the United States, that SNAP, the food stamp program, is 50 different programs. And in each state, people do it differently. You can drive people crazy. You can do asset tests. You can make them do reporting. You can try and do forced work and so forth. And you drive people off without really helping them. The thing about a universal thing that comes from either the central and regional governments together, a universal thing like the child allowance, every kid's parents get it until the kid gets old or parents change, which can happen because of death or whoever. And that's it. You don't have to keep re-reporting and re-changing. You just make sure that you're counting each kid once and at least one of the parents is getting the money. And it takes out that judgment. And local judgment is like that, as you well know, in small places all the time. So it's hard to run it when local judgment's important. When someone looks poor and they really need help, and you decide, oh, they only look poor, they're getting money from their children. Their children can afford to support them. Those calls are really hard, and it leads to differential participation, and that's one of the costs. Of course, their targeted programs are much cheaper, but substituting the judgment of village elders about who's needy and not for their actual situation is really, it's difficult. And it's hard to do when you end up, with very uneven take up and so forth. And so that, I don't like those systems. They do exist, I know. Qingao's book on poverty in China it's Qingao. She's was a student at Columbia who I actually helped her get her immigration papers together. She was at Fordham. They went to hire the best Chinese expert in the States they could find on social policy, so they hired her back. And she's very approachable, very nice. She's written a lot on it, on this particular issue. So, modernizing that system, I think, is important, and deciding whether a child allowance is worthwhile. But, there are ways too, guaranteeing jobs to people. In some countries, even shaming people because they won't take a job or they don't seem to be working hard enough. Those things are hard. And in small towns and small communities where people are for a long time, that's really hard. So take up is influenced by the way the policy is delivered, not just by the policy itself. We found that in the United States, looking at, what we called the institutional or community considerations. What was the word, Robert, in that chapter 8, chapter 7? Contextual issues, okay? What was the context in which the benefits were delivered? So African Americans in the American South have never been treated well. And the nice thing about a child allowance is they can't do anything about it. It's just the federal government goes to them, like your earned income credit, the same thing. Something that's worked through the tax system, which turns out to be a little more, maybe not always as equitable in some cases if you have people who don't pay taxes, but it's much more efficient and it's easier to do this. And we've had some success in the United States. Our great earned income tax credit, called the Working Families Tax Credit in Europe, was our big contribution to how things could go. I can still remember being on German TV saying, "Your base," Bert Wagner yelling at me. He said, "What do you think of the ITC?" I said, "I think your wages are too high now." For the EITC, it's getting people full-time work at those wages and you can cover it. But now in Germany, it's important, and in other countries, the working family tax credit, targets money at the end of the year to families who have dependents, and it makes up for low wages. And it's virtually everyone in the United States likes that program because it emphasizes market work, and you don't get it unless you work. But it's turned out not to be enough. So the small child allowance we have goes with it. It goes with that. It's not opposed. There's no conditioning between them. And so I think that's a major step forward. But anyway, we'll see.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So
Thank you.
yeah, I don't see any additional questions from the chat box. And the time is about up. So thanks, Professor Smithy, for your excellent talk. And so we can move on to the next presentation.